want to say first, thank you for being here this afternoon. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Yako Kanimasu, who has been a very pleasant supervisor to work with. And also Tue Rikwita is my secondary supervisor. I'll be discussing some central themes and components of a research project I've been working on as part of my MA in sociology, entitled Exploring Ethnic and National Identification, Interpretive Inquiry Among Persons of Indo-Fijian and iTaukei descent, or in quotes, mixed race persons. And that is something that perhaps we can discuss whether it's appropriate to use the term mixed race for persons of Indo-Fijian and iTaukei descent. This is an outline of the presentation. I want to first off introduce myself in terms of my own mixedness and discuss how that dynamics relate to the topic of ethnicity and nationality, and discuss some issues and themes in the literature on mixed race, especially from the Anglo-American context, and then discuss some key points on Fiji's context as it relates to racism and politics. I'll discuss the methodological design and very briefly the conceptual framework of how I view identity work, and a few snippets of some anticipated findings based on a few talks that I've had with participants. And then some very modest implications will end off the presentation. So perhaps based on what you've already taken note of by the way that I speak or by how I look, I'm not from Fiji. I'm from Belize, which is a Central American and Caribbean state. And within this multicultural society, I've always found myself in certain talks and discussions and debates about what it means to be a Belizean as it relates to our culture, as it relates to our territory also being placed geographically between these two regions. This is a photo of my parents who, perhaps for some of you, you would say they look Indian. And in Belize, we would say they look Spanish or mestizo. And according to many back home, I also look mestizo. The problem for me with classifying as a mestizo is that my first language is not Spanish, which is perhaps one of the most crucial items when you want to say that you are mestizo. I spoke Creole as my first language, which is a language influenced by the English language and African influence. And for some strange reason, I have this memory that in primary school, towards the end of primary school, my lecturer, the teacher, was having a discussion on Belize's cultures, and we have about 6 main cultures in Belize. And she was describing very briefly these different cultures, and for me, it was problematic to say that I am mestizo, again, because of the language, and to say that I'm Creole when my parents look mestizo. You know, and so I remember going to my mom and asking her, well, what am I? And she would say, oh, you have mixed, we have mixed ancestries in our family. And for me, that kind of meant that, well, I'm Creole because in Belize, we also use Creole for various things. For any person that is mixed, we would say, oh, they're Creole. But Creole also means in Belize persons who have direct ancestors who are African or English. And so those are some of the troubling aspects of me identifying as a mestizo, as a Creole, or as a Maya, which is my surname. Kokom is a Maya surname. And those experiences for me sort of highlight the contradiction and the perspectives that one has of issues of ethnicity and nationalism. This photo here is of my grandparents, and for some of you it basically seems my grandmother looks like a white person, and this is because she has a Turkish ancestry. And this is my grandfather. This is actually my step-grandfather, and a fact that I did not know until late teens. It was kept hidden from the family that this was actually my step-grandfather. And my biological grandfather was living in the nation-state of Guatemala, which also has a territorial claim over Belize. So one could imagine how problematic it is to tell people that you have a biological grandfather in Guatemala. So these are some of the labels that I tend to use occasionally when describing myself. And problematically, until the university years, when I reach the university and I meet friends who are Creole, and they're like, oh, you're not Creole, you're mestizo. And I begin to just say, well, I'm Belizean. So to get rid of all these ethnic sort of questions, I just say I'm Belizean. For most people, that still doesn't satisfy them. They want me to identify with a group. And again, the whole Asia, Caribbean, Central America, and I have family in Mexico and in Guatemala. So those are some of the aspects. And in Fiji, when I enter taxis, most times the driver would speak to me in Hindi. And of course, I began to see, like I don't understand. And so one get past when you're mixed ethnicity and your physique does not determine you easily into one ethnic group. You begin to, people ask you whether you're from Rio or whether you're from the Philippines. So those are some of the aspects when we talk about ethnicity in the daily lives of people. So to put, yeah, even Kiribati, yeah, some persons have asked me if I'm from Kiribati. To put it into context now more formally, the research questions then are, how do persons of mixed parentage, persons who have one parent iTaukei and one parent Indo-Fijian, identify? What labels do they use, and how are these labels different, negotiated for them at different points in their lives? I also want to ask, what are the perspectives on the institutionalization of the term Fijian, which, as we know, was very recent in 2010, that officially all citizens are to be called Fijians. And thirdly, well, what does this tell us about Fiji's racial politics? So those are the three research questions that I'm working with. And in terms of the mixed race studies literature, there are several themes that come out. For quite some centuries, we saw a pathology of the mixed race persons as persons who are in a state of identity crisis, are rebellious to the social order, especially for the whites. So those are some of the themes there. And starting in the 1980s and 1990s, there's a rise in terms of multiracial movements in the US and the UK for persons who are pushing towards census categories that would allow them to indicate their mixed ancestry, or simply a multiracial category of identification. And that leads to a new set of studies on mixed race. And of course, there are critiques by persons who are saying, oh, this just simply means a rejection of African ancestry, a rejection of the civil rights movement successes. So there are concerns by people in the Anglo-American context that that it had become too essentialist, simply saying that mixed race people think they are the solution to racism, which historically does not prove to be the case. And there's also an emerging paradigm called critical mixed race studies, which seeks to interrogate the wider social processes of mixed race identification. I'll just discuss now one or two of these critical mixed race studies. For instance, Betty's work in the US, she did 16 individual interviews with women, and also had two or three group interviews with the same participants as I am also doing. What came out of our study was that most of our participants identified as a woman of color or mixed race person, but did not want to identify as simply white. Of course, this is also reflective of our own participants, who most of were very well educated and were critical of racism in America. What we also see is that these aspects of identification depends on the context and the situations that they were in. For instance, whether you're talking about your family, at school, and at different points in their life, they would sort of describe themselves differently. And how also factors such as age, gender, sexuality, their location and class intersect with their notions of identity. I'll just discuss now Rocha's work, which is in New Zealand. Her work is on the part Chinese European citizens. What is very interesting about this study is that in New Zealand, since 1991, citizens have had the opportunity to self-ascribe to more than one ethnic category. This is unlike in the US and the UK. Whereas the concept of ethnicity is used in official and academic settings in New Zealand, the construct of race remains the common currency by which people speak of cultural identities there. Rocha is also keen to point out that racial categorization was crucial in the underpinning of policies that defined the early nation of New Zealand. Chinese were viewed as the race aliens and were never part of the national narrative, which emphasizes a unity between the natives and Europeans. This also calls for us into question how much of our discussions on nationalism in Fiji has centered on the iTaukei or Fijian and the Indo-Fijian at the expense of other Pacific Islanders here and mixed race persons. The state in New Zealand provides the term New Zealander as a civic identity under which you people still identify different ethnic categories. Yet, for some participants, they feel that unless one is white in New Zealand, they are never completely a New Zealander. And while most persons still use the New Zealander first as a social term for identification, there's still some troubles and some mixed emotions regarding what it means to be a part European, part Chinese, European in New Zealand. Tate studies in the UK, and she just basically what that study shows for us is that persons can be critically aware of how discourses want to shape our understanding of self. For instance, if you're in some of her participants, say she considers herself black, but because she listens and loves to listen to punk music, she would be self-critical in the sense that she recognizes that for most people this form of music isn't associated with being black. So those are some of the examples of empirical work, and I'll discuss the whole sort of literature on mixed race here in Fiji shortly. But what I want to do now is just sort of highlight some key aspects of the context of Fiji. And we know that with the recent 2007 census, the Taukei and Indo-Fijian remain the two most populous groups. Yet I caution that these ethnic groups aren't really homogeneous categories. Many of the stereotypical images and attributes we place on these labels do not reflect the heterogeneity of the peoples here in Fiji. For example, we must also note that within those we consider Ethiopian or Fijian, they were since pre-colonial and colonial times linguistically, culturally, politically diverse peoples that came to be termed as the Fijian race or the native race. This process of racialization then can be remarked as well in other contexts such as the African experience, the Indian experience, whereby in the case of India, Indo-Fijians came from different cultural, religious, political, and ideological backgrounds and practices, yet they were simply referred to as the Indian race. And for us today, these terms remain very much in these stereotypical images and heavily influence the political undertones and the rhetoric of the military coups in the years 1987, 2000, and even 2006. I included this slide simply to say that this whole aspect of racialization in Fiji very much depends on your historical perspective. If you believe that colonialism was good for Fiji, then you wouldn't see it in the way that I do, as well as other scholars who believe that racism and the mode of production heavily influenced and exploited peoples here in Fiji. Therefore, the colonial period established and solidified certain discursive parameters of social interaction, as we can see in specific social spaces such as the political governance of the country, the military, the labor, education, and how these various parameters of social interaction continue to influence Fiji even after independence, where despite the many talks about Fiji being multicultural or multiracial, which was the key term back then, there were no institutions or policies really to promote a multicultural society after independence. At the same time, this racialization, this aspect of differentiating between the us and the other, did not lead into absolute no reaction or no social reaction between the two groups. For instance, we have a case of Hiale Taragi, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name right, who was an Indo-Fijian who married a Fijian woman in the early 1900s. And I'm basing myself here in Kelly and Kaplan's ethnographic work. This person, after living 20 years in a Fijian village, had applied to the Fijian district official to be treated as a native. This, of course, meant access to land. He was supported by the highest provincial officer in the district, but the colonial secretary did not agree. For instance, it says the colonial secretary replied to the request saying that this would set an undesirable precedent by opening the door to East Indians securing by marriage with Fijians the use of native land without paying rent. Would his children have the right to be registered as a member of the Matankali? Fiji's Executive Council had it announced that it was considered and advised that it was not competent for the governor in council to sanction the formal recognition of an Indian as a Fijian. There would be no doorways across boundaries of race, especially for Fiji Indians, writes Kelly and Kaplan. This is very interesting because we also see that the Europeans and the colonial administration made sure that they encouraged a separatism between the two groups. But at the same time, they still occurred these interactions between them. This resulted that intermarriages between Indo-Fijians and Fijians remained very much unreported during the colonial period. And today, documenting statistically how many intermarriages have happened would require great time and familiarity with the names and language, because at the registry, the ethnicity or the race of the woman is not clearly marked out. One would have to detect based on the name of the person on the registry. However, Carton in 1995, a publication, he suggested, based on his analysis, that there were about 351 mixed race persons in the 1946 census or registry. I have not been able to verify this record. Now, with regard to mixed race persons in Fiji, one would have to center the discussion on part Europeans, and there are several explorative studies on this topic, and particularly the study by Osborne, which is the most recent one in 1998, as part of her MA work here at USP. What we see in terms of part Europeans in Fiji is similar themes that have been recognized in Anglo-America, the pathology of mixed race, and to some extent we are now seeing some celebration of mixed race persons by some scholars here in Fiji. But in terms of the historical context, we see that colonial administrations in Fiji viewed part Europeans as mentally dull, devious, untrustworthy, lazy, and lacking all the chiefly qualities that the administrator admired in the Fijian population. This, of course, is just one perspective. There were those persons who believe that by being part European, you have sort of access to both worlds. And these are just some statistics of the part European population. And part of the reason why the part European population has been able to grow in Fiji is because they developed Kailoma clans by intermarrying mixed race persons or part Europeans. And this is unlike with intermarriages between the Indo-Fijian and iTaukei people. So that would be sort of a difference there to historically consider. There was also a sort of debate similar to other contexts where the debate is whether having mixed race persons would lead to the development of the native people, or would it be seen to be an obstacle for their evolutionary development, or even a degradation for the white superiority. So those sort of debates that we see happening in New Zealand and Australia are similarly concerns among some of the colonial administrators during the early 1900s. And they were offered specific restrictions and privileges at different points. For instance, wealthy part Europeans in the 1920s and 30s had to argue legally, on legal terms, for their children to be educated at grammar school, at the government grammar school, because they weren't accepted because they were part Europeans. And there are also different restrictions and privilege in terms of politics, in terms of even social drinking. Alcohol was forbidden for part Europeans for some years. So these sort of aspects sort of shaped or constricted the social interactions of part Europeans with other groups in Fiji. And it's also important to know that, as with most groups here in Fiji, one's identification depends on your paternal classification. So to be a part European really depended if your father was white, and it didn't matter if your mother was white or from any other ethnic group. And there have been various terms to refer to part Europeans, including Kailoma, Vasu, half-caste, persons of European descent. And for some people in recent years, for example, with Lucy de Bruce, she has written how the Kailoma identity is fragmented and in deep crisis. And for her, she was writing in response to the 1997 constitutional review to have the Kailomas given much more recognition and representation within the state. So we are kind of seeing a level of celebration of part Europeans and identity politics, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if you are a part European yourself. This is just Osborne's study, and it's recent, and what it shows for us among young persons was that some terms historically considered derogatory are used by themselves. For instance, half-caste. Some people have no problem describing themselves as a half-caste, and whereas also most people preferred it, and these were young persons between the ages about 15 to 20 odd, and most of them described themselves as part European. That was their preferred ethnic identity label. Osborne's study has a sort of ecological focus, which sort of sees how different systems, as they term it, influences social identification. Basically, how your family, how your friends, how school, how religion shapes people's identification. Now, since the 2006 coup, we have seen sort of a different rhetoric or moral vision, depending on your view of the coup itself, to put an end to racism. The government arguably attempts to foster a national identity by dissolving, for instance, the native institution called the Great Council of Chiefs, communal politics. But one also has to ask whether these aspects aren't also giving more salience to the politicization of ethnicity in Fiji. And I'm reminded of Stuart Hall's quote where he mentions ideology without guarantees, in the sense that while the ideology may seem to be positive and seem to be good, we have no sort of unnecessary correspondence that this will result in good social relations in Fiji, or will be interpreted as a good set of policies by the citizens themselves. And these labels, Fijian, Indo-Fijian, iTaukei, have always been contested. Prior to independence, when Fijian was proposed as a national identity label, for some iTaukei politicians and intellectuals of Fijian culture, they saw it as a threat by the Indo-Fijians, proposing that the term Fijian be used to refer to everyone. And we've also seen, in terms of the constitutions, sort of the terms Fijian race and Indian race were widely used in even the 1917-1919 constitution, despite the fact that we know that the construct of race had been long challenged. In 1997, too, that constitution sought to have all citizens identify as Fiji Islander, and in my opinion, this did not take hold, partly because it was a new term, and also in part because we had the coup in 2000. Now the 2013 constitution states that all citizens are Fijians. Of course, there have been some problems with this, and it is received with mixed reactions amongst the population. We've had several studies that have sort of investigated what are the opinions on this. And in terms of the term Fijians and how it came about in usage, some have proposed, such as Robertson, that it is actually a corruption of the iTaukei word Viti, which was used to refer to some parts of the country. The term Indo-Fijian itself emerged until the 1980s and 1990s by scholars, Indian scholars who began to use this popularize this term as a term in terms of politics for identification. So we see clearly then that Fijian as a term for national or ethnic identification are very contested labels, but also the term Fijian has always been proposed by scholars and activists as that key term that would allow the society to get a greater sense of belonging within the state. And Bainimarama's regime's use of this term makes his governments appear in the interest of social justice, or perhaps in your view, it is in the interest of social justice, but this symbolic change is received with mixed reactions. And this is where the research comes into play, and how I'll get some interpretive material that would give some other perspectives on this issue of ethnic and national identification. I'll be doing individual interviews and group interviews with about 8 to 9 participants, and I've been able to contact 9 persons who have expressed interest in the research, and most of them are persons with a bachelor's degree, and all of them will be in Suva location so that I will be able to have that group interview with them. Also, most of them have an Indo-Fijian father as opposed to having an iTaukei father. It seems then that the pressures for an iTaukei man to marry outside the group are higher than for an Indo-Fijian male person, especially Muslims. The methodological assumptions are heavily influenced by a critical interpretive framework, which, as we perhaps are well aware of, is an interpretive inquiry that seeks to give voice or bring to the forefront the perspective, experiences, and perceptions of social actors. In terms of its philosophy, it is believed that knowledge is always embedded in socio-political relations. The aim here is not to create a report that would be able to generalize about the experiences here in Fiji, or that the report itself is an objective research. It encourages research on issues of race, gender, nation, and democracy. And the purpose of research is viewed as an interpretive inquiry that would allow us to gain a different or a better understanding of the issue at hand. The individual interviews, and I'm sure most of us are well acquainted with what are the implications here. Basically, this would allow me to gain the narratives of persons rather than having them select predefined answers, and also allow me to hear their narratives rather than pose sociological questions to participants. I'll also do group interviews. The purpose of doing both individual and group interviews is also to provide a different set of interpretive material to the study, a different angle. This is on the premise that a social interaction between 2 persons would be different among 3 to 4 persons. So it allows precisely for the objectives of the research to be met, to see if identification is negotiated and situated differently based on the type of social setting that one is in. As stated, I have a purposive sample of about 8 to 9 persons. The goal is not to generalize the findings, but to provide an interpretive analysis on the ways that identification is situated. I will include both males and females. And as I've said, perhaps one of the disadvantage here is that I won't be able to sort of emphasize very clearly the dynamics of how class, age, gender, location, amongst other factors, really intersect one's identification. In terms of analysis, I'm yet to settle exactly how it will shape, but I'm looking at the typical qualitative analysis, which is thematic analysis, which seeks to generate patterns and codes among all the interpretive material But I'm also considering a narrative analysis which places much greater focus on each individual participant and their own stories, as opposed to trying to find patterns all across the interviews. I've also kept a reflexive journal where I'm trying to keep track of my own assumptions, my own inputs in how these interviews and the research is being constructed. Very briefly, in terms of identity and how I view this concept, I highlight 4 key terms here. The first is that identity is relational. Unlike some models which would say that identity reveals an inner core of self, or that self which develops over time, one can also view identity as identification. That is, it is a relationship with either them or us. And in this sort of setting, especially in Fiji, where we have sort of dominant stereotypes of the two groups that I'm talking about, it provides that sort of angle from which to better understand how people would view themselves. It is also discursive in the sense that we acknowledge how different ideologies and economic, social, political practices influences one concept of self. Identification is also very much interactional. And here I'm thinking of Goffman's theory in particular, how the presentation of self would very much depend on which type of person you are talking with. It is also multiple, and this is perhaps a very common sort of interpretation amongst postmodern and feminist researchers, who would highlight that one's concept of self depends also on other factors which cannot easily be disentangled from a self, such as sex, education, your class, your work, the location, and family backgrounds. And some of the key theories that are informing that sort of pragmatic approach to identity are Stuart Hall, Sinisa Malcevic, Irving Goffman, and Richard Jenkins. I could probably describe those more if we have time at the end. In terms of some anticipated findings, some of the terms that are being used by part Indian Fijian are, some person would have said, they consider themselves quota, like they are part of this and that. Some persons have been called half caste, but most persons, at least 4 persons that I've spoken with, don't use that for themselves, but they do recognize that some persons would see them as a half caste. Or part Indian Fijian would also be a label of identification. And it also depends on what point of their life they're referring to. For most persons during their childhood years, they would identify with just one racial or ethnic group. And that is basically to say this, that the negotiations depends on who they are speaking with and in which settings they are. Also, unlike in the Anglo-American context where racism and aspects of feeling rejection is very dominant, it is not so much the case here in Fiji. In fact, some people would say they don't understand why academics talk so much about the stereotypes of Indians and Fijians. They've asked, where do we get the information from? Also, this sort of mixed ancestry is reflected even in their names, where some persons would have a first name that is a Christian name and a Muslim second name. So those are some of the dynamics being mixed race or part Indian Fijian. Some persons, at least 3 persons have said that by being mixed race, they feel like they have the right to sort of talk more freely about the stereotypes in Fiji, such as that the Fijian is from the jungle, or during kava sessions, they could joke around this, and their justification for that setting would be that they are both, so they can talk about it. So those are some of the aspects and experiences of part Indian Fijian. Also, language and appearance are 2 key components that persons feel allows them to easily interact with iTaukei and Indo-Fijians. And most persons have a positive attitude towards the Fijian label being used as a civic identity label, especially since 2010 and the 2013 Constitution. But some persons are also concerned about how it is being imposed. They like the label, but they just don't like that it's coming from illegitimate authority. So those are some of the anticipated findings. Modestly, the research allows us a different set of perspectives on these issues, encourages further research in multiculturalism and mixed race, and provides us with a different level of concepts of working with identity, and a potential resource for mixed race persons or activists here in Fiji. To end the presentation, just want to state that I'm currently conducting interviews. I actually have 2 interviews after this seminar with participants, and I'll also be working on my historical context, theoretical chapter, and analysis to conclude this research on exploring ethnic and national identification by September of this year. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions,